Hey guys, how's it going? Hope everyone's doing well. Had a good weekend. I wasn't able to record yesterday, just got busy with some school stuff, but looking forward to getting back into it again today and for the rest of this week. I'm happy to announce that I finally got my website going. So there's not a whole lot on it right now, but if you go over to the Realpolitik, I've got my first article up, and that's what I wanted to cover today. Eventually give it about a week or two, and I should have it more filled out with some articles that'll fill in a lot of these gaps. But for right now, it's pretty bare bones. But anyways, wanted to kind of talk a little bit about my article, with the idea being just a bipartisan counterproposal to the Democrats' stimulus plan. So, as I'm sure if you've been following the news and politics as of late, we all know that Biden has proposed this $1.9 trillion bill, and the Democratic House of Representatives has taken it up, just went through the budget committee, and it looks like they are planning a vote at the end of this week, either on Friday or Saturday, most likely, from which point it'll go over to the Senate and potentially be in law before the unemployment benefits expire, the expanded unemployment benefits expire on March 14th. So that's kind of the timeline. We'll most likely see a bill one way or another in law by I guess, the first half of March, which is good news. I am in favor of an additional round of stimulus. However, while the final House bill will end up being a little bit different than Biden's proposed plan, I do think that there are some big changes that should be made, in particular to the larger parts of the bill where where they're really having the biggest effect on the economy and in generally speaking the deficits with regards to the large amount of spending. It's important to mention, one thing I didn't really mention in this bill in my article is that the U.S. in 2020 put forward almost $4 trillion of spending. Pretty close to, I want to say, especially when you take into account post-COVID GDP, almost 20% of GDP in terms of emergency spending, which I think is needed. You have this crisis that is effectively the equivalent of putting the country on war footing, and you need spending to help counteract the cyclicality of that. So again, totally in favor of having some level of additional support. And I think that the Republicans, generally speaking, recognize this as well. You had a bipartisan group of, or sorry, a group of 10 Republican so-called moderates led by Susan Collins that proposed a $618 billion bill to support reopening schools, support additional money for vaccines and testing, provide $1,000 stimulus checks with a lower cutoff than the current $75,000 a year for one individual. And I thought personally that gave like a good kind of like base to work off of, especially considering we just passed $900 billion of COVID relief and stimulus back in December. However, it doesn't really appear that President Biden, or at the very least his advisors in the White House and the Democrats in the House and Senate, really have much of an interest in entertaining that. So I wanted to propose, basically some sort of, counter plan to that. And with the idea of, I think that you could get a bipartisan group of senators and probably Republicans in the House too to support a stimulus bill, that instead of being 1.9 trillion or whatever they end up scoring the current House bill to be, to one that is closer to 1.2 to maybe 1.5 trillion dollars. Still a lot of money, just I think a little bit lower in terms of the sticker shock, and really provides for like investments in the economy. Because I personally think that one of the biggest issues about all of the COVID stimulus is that it's been primarily redistributive in nature. Redistributive in the sense of that we're basically borrowing future consumption and transferring it to the present, which you need to do some of that, obviously, because there's been such a severe shock to the economy. However, we're now at the point when we take a look at where coronavirus cases are going, where they're down about 70% since their peaks at the start of January, still at a high level. But this is basically telling us that people are going to get back to normal, I think, a little bit sooner than we are currently expecting. And when you add in that with the current rate of immunization, which right now, following the dip due to the extreme colds, it's at about 1.4 million now. I would expect by the end of the March to get end of February to get back where we were last week, around 1.7 million, potentially closer to 2 million a day, which means that, in my opinion, we're going to be reaching herd immunity probably by early April, when you take into account both the vaccinations and the people who have already been infected by COVID, which means that, basically the main impediment to the economy right now is people's unwillingness to spend and get back to normal due to COVID. Once that's gone, it gets back more or less to normal pretty quickly, which will be great. And what that means, in my opinion, is that, and if you read through the article, you can kind of get a little bit more detailed sense. But, my main issue comes from these four big planks: the direct payments, extension of unemployment programs, and extension and expansion, I should say, $350 billion in aid to state and local governments, and raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025, and guaranteeing that tipped workers are paid the full federal minimum wage. So just to go through these quickly, I don't think that they should do anything about the stimulus checks, because the thing is that they're just so popular by the American people. Politically speaking, it, in my mind, kind of unfortunately does not make any sense politically to lower them. The support is 79% to 16% in last week's Economist YouGov poll. So overwhelming support for that. It's the most popular measure in the plan. But going to the extension of the unemployment benefits, I think that one thing that gets lost on a lot of people is that when they did the first expansion to $600 a week, which the Democrats, to my understanding, kind of like snuck in at the last moment. If you recall right, like a group of 4 Republican senators threatened to vote against the bill because they kind of snuck this in at the last minute. Ultimately, they went along with it, but the objection was still raised, and that was because you were paying 75% of people a higher wage than they were beforehand. And, again, it's tough to target these things perfectly, so that's just like an accepted cost. But even now at the current $300 level, 50% of people are making more money than they were before. So as we start to, what the Democrats want to do is to increase that to $400 a week through August 29th. Well, I'll argue that by basically June, from a health perspective, we should be more or less back to normal with regards to, getting back to work, which means that businesses are going to need workers. And people, I believe, generally speaking, people are rational, that they do want to go back to work so that they can make, their working wage. However, I don't think that rational people are going to accept lower wages than they can get by, not by remaining unemployed and waiting for those programs to expire on August 29th. So my proposal to kind of counteract that is to keep it at $300 a week in terms of the expansion, and do a gradual phase out. So I propose that beginning June 1st, it would be reduced to $250 a week expansion, by July 1st, $200, and by August 1st, $100 before expiring August 29th. That way you kind of provide like some sort of glide path, if you will, for people to get off of the benefits and to get back to work. The next major thing is the $350 billion in aid to state and local governments. My main problem with this is that my understanding is that it's largely unrestricted aid to the states. This should not be the case. My main concern is that, you'll take states, and I'll go through some of these articles here, but the money will go to certain states, like where I'm living right now, like Illinois, for that matter, Kentucky, New Jersey, Connecticut, states with severe, chronic funding problems, with poorly funded public pensions, that they will get the money in relief, and they will just use that federal money to stopgap those chronic spending problems, as opposed to just the damage done by COVID. It actually turns out that the hit to state and local revenues is considerably smaller than most people had expected at the start of the crisis. The change has been severe in some places, in particular places where they do not have a progressive mode of taxation, so they haven't been able to take advantage of, some of the rising incomes of, higher skilled workers, people that rely on capital gains taxes. But still, they've done a lot better than most people had feared. Yet the $350 billion in aid is considerably more than that. And really, I don't think serves like a, that great of a purpose. So I think that what they should do in order to be fair to all states, including states that have, over long periods of time managed their budgets well, what they should do is convert the $350 billion in blank check aid into something tied to, for example, infrastructure spending, or trying to fill in the roughly $1 trillion of deferred infrastructure maintenance that is around the country. And that could kind of be like a prelude to a larger infrastructure and green energy bill that Joe Biden also wants to get done. This would be like a good start. And, the $350 billion, of course, it flows through the economy. Companies that get that income to fulfill contracts, they'll have to pay taxes to the state. People will go and spend that money. It'll increase states with, sales taxes, boost their revenues somewhat. It'll have some good knockoff effects like that. All the while not providing these perverse incentives for states who have chronically mismanaged their finances. And then the last bit that I wanted to address is the raising the minimum wage. It's a very contentious issue, and frankly, I think it gets a little bit overstated by both progressives and conservatives and libertarians like myself in terms of its potential effects. More detail can be found in the recent CBO report about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, where they do predict that it would, increase the wages of many, lift a decent number of people out of poverty, and also on the flip side, eliminate about 1.4 million jobs if it were to be raised to $15 an hour by 2035. Now, I personally think that, so long as like the prevailing wage in the economy, right? Like at the moment, I want to say there's about 390,000 people that actually make the minimum wage in the United States, a very small group of people. And of course, there are more people that make between, $7.25 and $15 an hour that would benefit from this. But I do think that the problem about raising the minimum wage now is that most minimum wage workers are tied to the restaurant industry, the leisure industry, low service paying jobs, low paying service jobs. And those people would be hit the hardest in the event that they, in terms of where the job losses are going to incur. It doesn't make sense to me that right now where restaurants are hurting so much, literally not able to, many of them shutting down because they can't afford to continue operations. And not only are you going to increase the federal minimum wage, but you're also going to eliminate the tipped wage, which means that those people's labor costs are going to go from, I'm honestly not terribly familiar with what the tipped wages are by state or on a federal level, but let's say they're going to go from $3 an hour all the way up to $15 an hour. Frankly, I think that those types of input costs are going to, hurt a lot of workers. And for that matter, even if they don't, those costs, I think one of the things that gets lost in this debate is that by at least the proponents of the minimum wage is that many people think like you just raise the minimum wage and that difference goes straight to the workers, right? Like the big corporate CEOs, they take that pay cut, and the shareholders, they take that pay cut, and that money instead goes to the workers who, in their opinion, are entitled to, as they say, like a living wage of $15 an hour, which I'll note that in many places, $15 is not a living wage. It is considerably higher, especially if you're in a city like New York or Boston or San Francisco. But that's neither here nor there. The problem is that it doesn't just work that simply. Companies largely operate on the basic like economic assumption that the marginal revenue that a worker provides has to equal or exceed the marginal cost of hiring that worker. If that doesn't hold, that worker will either be laid off, hours will be reduced, or in an attempt to offset the revenue, those costs will be passed on to consumers. And as is usually the case in economics, is that it's usually a combination of those factors. It doesn't necessarily, I'm not saying that people will lose all their jobs, but I'm just saying that there are other costs that need to be reckoned with. And raising $15 an hour by 2033 means that, inflation adjusted by that time, the minimum wage will be higher than what it is right now, accounting for inflation. And it does so in a manner that's a little bit more responsibly. And if that means that in exchange for that, Republicans can get some other concessions that, bring the total cost of the bill to like $1.2 to $1.5 trillion over 10 years, it'll make more sense. So, I'll just kind of conclude on that note, but there was this great article here. Yes, it is possible to have too much stimulus by Greg Ip at the end of last December. And he does a good job of explaining that basically, we can have too much stimulus. We can, 80% of recipients either save their money or use it down to pay, or use their stimulus checks to pay down debt when they receive them back in March. We're effectively giving money to those same 80% of people who don't necessarily need the money. We could target it so that, like he says here, returning the 10% poorest households to their February level of income would take $1.5 billion a month, and then for the lower 50% of the population by income, the price is $16 billion. So, they could have targeted this bill to be much more narrowly targeted towards those people to help the people who really need it. But unfortunately, it's not. And no bill can be perfect. No bill can perfectly target any specific demographic that's hurting. So there will be trade-offs. But I do think that it makes sense to try to have some level of compromise with the Republicans. And, as you guys know, I'm biased because of my political persuasions. But I do think that it makes sense to have another stimulus bill. But I also think it makes sense that we don't want to overheat the economy, and we want to make sure that this aid goes to people who actually need it, as opposed to, frankly, people like me who will receive that stimulus check, but really don't need the money. And most people will be like that. And of course, I'm not going to turn down free money along with most people. And I, like most people, do favor receiving additional money from the government. But from a public policy perspective, we want to be targeting it to the people that are actually hurting the most. And, I think that, we can take some solace in this last slide here. This is from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. The latest estimate is for Q1 economic growth to be 9.5%, which is great. That's huge. And frankly, I think that it will even without any stimulus, it's going to rebound considerably as well in Q2 once the effects of COVID start to dissipate. So anyways, I'll end it on that kind of optimistic note. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this. I'll keep on posting some videos and some articles for you guys to read. Thanks again for your support, and I hope you guys have a good day. Bye.